Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we'll be looking at societal change,
Ooh.
but through a pretty unique lens, I think.
Yeah.
We're going to be comparing personal crises to national upheavals,
Wow.
kind of like those, massive historical earthquakes,
Yeah.
but for entire countries.
It's fascinating how we can look at these periods of, intense pressure and change
Yeah.
and see how individuals and nations kind of navigate through those.
Exactly. And our guide for this journey is Jared Diamond's book, Upheaval.
Oh, yeah.
And he argues that the way we deal with our own personal crises can actually give us clues about how entire societies adapt and evolve.
That's a very interesting concept.
It is, right.
Yeah,
And he starts by sharing a personal story,
he does.
his own crisis. Actually, during his PhD studies at Cambridge,
Oh.
he was feeling like a total failure, ready to abandon science altogether.
Now, that is not the image that comes to mind when I think of Jared Diamond.
Right. Failure. What
Right.
happened?
Well, Diamond, brilliant as he is, admits that he wasn't the best at building this complex equipment he needed for his research on electric eels.
Oh,
And that lack of hands-on skill really hit his confidence hard.
I can see that, it's easy to feel inadequate when you're surrounded by these brilliant minds and you're just struggling to keep up.
Absolutely.
That pressure to succeed,
Yeah,
it can be intense.
it can.
And Diamond realized that this feeling of not measuring up,
Yeah.
of questioning your path and your abilities,
Mm-hmm.
is a common thread in personal crises.
Yeah.
We face what seem like impossible challenges.
Right.
We grapple with, who we are and what we value, and we have to find new ways to cope.
New coping mechanisms, exactly.
So he's saying that even though these crises feel deeply personal,
Yeah,
there are these patterns, almost like a universal language of crisis.
exactly. And
Okay.
to show us how these patterns play out on a larger scale,
Okay.
Diamond takes us back to a tragic historical event.
All right.
The Coconut Grove nightclub fire in 1942.
Oh, yeah.
Nearly 500 people died in that horrific fire.
That's just awful.
Can you imagine that collective trauma?
It's hard to even fathom.
The grief, the guilt felt by the survivors and the families.
But I'm guessing this tragedy ties into Diamond's theory somehow.
It does.
Okay.
The Coconut Grove fire became a turning point in how we understand and respond to crisis.
Okay.
Therapists were suddenly faced with this immense wave of suffering
Mm-hmm.
and had to develop new ways to help people cope.
So this tragedy actually led to the development of crisis therapy as we know it today.
Precisely. The Coconut Grove fire forced therapists to grapple with the immense emotional toll of crisis and to develop new approaches for helping people rebuild their lives. And those early efforts have had a lasting impact on how we understand and deal with crises both individually and collectively.
That's a powerful point, that even out of immense tragedy,
Yeah,
there can be progress and new understanding.
absolutely.
But what about those larger scale societal crises?
Yeah.
Where do those fit in?
Well, Diamond argues that national crises often follow a similar pattern to individual ones.
Okay.
He uses the example of Britain's decline after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a sudden collapse,
Right.
but a slow, simmering crisis.
Okay.
Imagine a nation grappling with the loss of its empire, facing economic hardship and social change.
Wow.
It's a lot like an individual facing a major life change.
It is.
Did you say?
Definitely a whole nation wrestling with its loss of identity,
Yeah.
trying to adapt to a new world order,
Mm-hmm.
just like someone figuring out who they are after a huge life event.
Yeah,
It's a fascinating parallel.
it is.
And this is where Diamond introduces the concept of selective change.
Yes.
The idea that both individuals and nations need to figure out which core values to hold on to
Right.
while adapting to new realities.
Yeah.
It's about finding that delicate balance between preserving what's essential and embracing what's necessary for survival and growth.
Mm.
It's like deciding which parts of yourself to hold on to while also evolving and growing as a person.
Exactly.
Not an easy task, either individually or on a national level.
No, it's not.
And to explore this further, Diamond looks at a range of countries, each facing a distinct type of crisis.
He does.
Finland's struggle against the Soviet Union,
Mm-hmm.
Japan's forced opening to the world,
Yeah,
Chile's descent into dictatorship.
right.
So he's using these different national case studies to see how they handled those make-or-break moments.
Exactly. He compares these countries to see what worked, what
Yeah.
failed, and what lessons we can draw from their successes and failures.
Okay.
He takes a narrative comparative approach, weaving together these stories of upheaval and transformation to understand the underlying patterns of crisis and response.
It's like looking at history as a giant laboratory
Yeah.
for understanding how societies deal with change.
It is.
But how does he actually break down those patterns?
Yeah.
What's his framework for analyzing these national upheavals?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Diamond identifies 12 key factors that influence how both individuals and nations navigate periods of immense change.
Wow.
These range from honest self-appraisal to accepting responsibility, from seeking help to learning from past experiences.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is that these factors, initially drawn from studies of personal crises,
Right.
seem to resonate powerfully on a national level as well.
So what works for a person struggling with a life crisis might also apply to a whole country facing its own existential threats.
Exactly.
That's a bold claim.
It is.
I'm curious to see how he backs it up.
Yeah,
Let's dive into some of those specific examples, shall we?
let's do it. All right, let's take a closer look at how those 12 factors play out in real-world scenarios.
Okay.
Diamond starts with Finland facing the Soviet Union in World War II.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about a David and Goliath situation.
Tiny Finland against the massive Soviet war machine.
Right.
It seems like an impossible fight, but Diamond says they actually hold their own.
They did, and one of the key reasons was their incredible national unity. They had this deep understanding of their history, shared values, and a fierce determination to defend their homeland.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just about waving flags,
Right.
It was about knowing who they were and what they were fighting for.
So national identity isn't just some abstract concept.
No.
Diamond's saying it's a real source of strength during a crisis.
Absolutely. Think about it when you're facing a major personal crisis.
Yeah.
Having a strong sense of self,
Yeah.
knowing your values and what you stand for helps you stay grounded.
Right.
It's the same for nations.
That makes sense, but it wasn't just about unity, right?
No.
Didn't the Finns also have a pretty unique approach to fighting the Soviets?
They did. Diamond highlights their ability to be brutally honest with themselves about the situation.
Oh,
They didn't underestimate the Soviet threat or pretend they had all the answers.
okay.
They acknowledged their limitations, but they also identified their strengths.
So instead of getting bogged down in denial or wishful thinking, they took a hard look at their situation and figured out how to play to their strengths.
Exactly. They knew they couldn't win a head-on fight,
Right,
so they used guerrilla tactics,
right.
taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain and the harsh winter conditions.
Oh.
They were adaptable and willing to change their approach while never losing sight of their ultimate goal, protecting their homeland.
That's such a powerful example of how adaptability and a willingness to change tactics can be crucial in a crisis,
Yeah,
even when the stakes are incredibly high.
absolutely.
Okay, so Finland shows us the power of unity and a clear-eyed assessment of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
But what about when a nation is forced to change, whether they like it or not?
That's what Japan faced in the mid-19th century.
Okay.
For centuries, they had intentionally isolated themselves from the world.
Right.
But then, in 1853, Commodore Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay with a fleet of American warships,
Oh, wow.
demanding that Japan open its ports to trade.
Talk about an unexpected wake-up call.
Yep.
So how did Japan, a nation that had deliberately shut itself off from the world, respond to this sudden pressure to change?
Well, there was definitely some resistance, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is that after a lot of internal debate and soul-searching,
Okay.
Japan's leaders decided to embrace change head-on.
Really?
Hmm.
They didn't try to cling to their old ways.
They realized their isolationist policies wouldn't work in this new world order.
Right.
So they did something pretty incredible.
What's that?
They launched into a period of rapid modernization and industrialization known as the Meiji Restoration.
Wow.
They were determined to catch up with the West and fast.
So instead of resisting change, they decided to use it to their advantage.
Mm-hmm.
But this wasn't just about copying technology, was it?
Not at all. It was a fundamental shift in their mindset.
Okay.
They became incredibly open to learning from other cultures, adapting their institutions and even their values to the demands of the modern world.
Huh.
They basically reinvented themselves as a nation.
That's a pretty radical transformation.
It is.
So what's the key takeaway here?
Yeah.
Is Diamond saying that being open to learning from others is essential for surviving a crisis?
Absolutely. Japan's success shows that acknowledging you don't have all the answers and being willing to learn from others, even those you might see as rivals, can be a powerful strategy for navigating change.
Mm-hmm.
It's about recognizing that sometimes the best solutions come from outside your own bubble.
That's a valuable lesson, not just for nations, but for individuals, too.
Yeah.
We all have blind spots.
Right.
And sometimes the best way to grow is to look beyond our own limited perspectives.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've seen how Finland's unity and Japan's openness help them navigate major upheavals.
Yeah.
But what about those cases where things go really wrong?
Hmm.
I'm thinking of Chile's descent into dictatorship in the 1970s.
That's a very different kind of crisis and a tragic one.
It is.
Chile had a long history of democracy, yet it experienced a sudden and violent shift to authoritarian rule. Diamond asks why a nation that seemed to have so much going for it would succumb to such a dramatic upheaval.
That's the million-dollar question, right?
It is.
What went wrong in Chile?
Well, Diamond points to several factors, some specific to Chile's political landscape,
Okay.
but others with eerie parallels to the patterns we've been discussing.
Yep.
He argues that one key issue was the failure of Chile's political system to effectively address growing economic and social problems.
So instead of tackling those problems head-on,
Right.
they festered and created deeper divisions within society.
Exactly. There was this growing sense of polarization, a widening gap between rich and poor, and a political system that seemed increasingly unable to find common ground or implement meaningful solutions.
Yeah.
It's a pattern that's unfortunately familiar in many countries that experience periods of intense political turmoil.
It's like that saying, a house divided against itself cannot stand.
Right.
But wasn't there also a lot of outside influence in Chile's crisis? I'm thinking of the U.S. role in supporting the opposition to Allende's government.
That's a complex and controversial issue.
It is.
Diamond acknowledges the role of external actors, but he emphasizes that ultimately the responsibility for Chile's fate lay with the Chileans themselves.
Oh.
He's not letting them off the hook,
Right.
but he's also acknowledging the complexities of international relations.
So it's a reminder that while outside forces can definitely play a role,
Yeah?
a nation's internal choices and actions are ultimately what determine its destiny.
Exactly. And in Chile's case, Diamond points to a number of internal factors that contributed to the crisis.
Okay, like what?
Deep political divisions, key economic mismanagement, and a failure to build a broad consensus around a shared vision for the future. It's a cautionary tale about the fragility of democracy and the importance of addressing internal challenges before they reach a breaking point.
That's a sobering thought. But Diamond doesn't just focus on the negative, right?
No, he doesn't.
He also talks about countries that successfully navigated their crises,
Yeah.
came out stronger on the other side.
He does. Germany, for example, after the utter devastation of World War II, had a remarkable recovery, both economically and politically.
Wow.
Diamond attributes this success in part to their willingness to confront their past, acknowledge their mistakes, and build a new national identity based on democratic values and international cooperation. It was a painful process, but ultimately a transformative one.
So facing your demons, owning up to past mistakes.
Yeah.
That's part of the recipe for successful crisis recovery.
It seems counterintuitive,
It does.
but it makes sense when you think about it.
It does. And Diamond also highlights Australia's transformation in the decades after World War II.
Yeah.
They moved away from their close ties to Great Britain and embraced a more multicultural and independent outlook. That's a big shift, redefining your national identity.
Yes.
Was that a sudden change or more of a gradual evolution?
What's fascinating about Australia is that this transformation happened gradually without a dramatic upheaval.
Okay.
It was a process of selective change driven by both internal and external factors,
Right.
but ultimately shaped by the choices Australians made.
So it's possible for nations to reinvent themselves without going through a violent revolution or a complete collapse.
It is.
That's pretty hopeful, actually.
It is, and it shows that Diamond's framework for understanding crisis isn't just about analyzing disasters.
Right.
It's also about identifying the factors that contribute to successful adaptation and growth,
Yeah.
whether it happens quickly or over a longer period of time.
Okay.
And that's a message that's relevant not just for historians or political scientists, but for all of us.
Right, because we're all facing challenges in our own lives.
Exactly.
And understanding how to navigate those challenges, how to adapt and evolve, is crucial for our well-being.
It is.
Okay, so we've explored Finland's unity, Japan's openness, Chile's tragic downfall, and Germany and Australia's successful transformations. It's a pretty diverse set of examples.
Yeah.
But I can see how those 12 factors Diamond talks about weave through all these stories.
They do. And what's really fascinating is how Diamond uses these historical examples to illuminate the challenges facing the United States today.
Okay.
He sees some worrying parallels between the factors that contributed to crises in other nations and the issues currently brewing in American society.
Okay, now we're getting to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
Diamond's not just telling us interesting historical stories.
No.
He's trying to help us understand our own present moment.
Exactly.
So what does he see as the biggest threats to the U.S.?
That's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've journeyed through all these, fascinating historical examples,
Yeah.
seeing how different nations have grappled with these, monumental changes.
Yeah.
Now Diamond turns his attention to the U.S.
Right.
and kind of says, there are some serious storm clouds brewing here. He identifies 4 major crises that could really shake things up in the coming years.
And these aren't exactly secret problems, are they?
No.
Political polarization, the outsized influence of money in politics, rising inequality, and a decline in investment in education and infrastructure.
We hear about these issues all the time.
We do.
It's like that feeling, when you should be doing your taxes, but you just keep putting it off. And the anxiety just keeps building and building.
Yeah.
We know these problems are out there.
Right.
But it's just easier to get caught up in the day-to-day and not confront them head on.
That's a great analogy.
Is it?
Yeah.
And Diamond's concern is that we're not just dealing with 4 separate issues here.
Right.
He sees them as interconnected symptoms of a deeper problem.
Yeah.
Sort of national malaise.
It's like a sickness almost.
Yeah. And it's not just that we're arguing more as a society.
Yeah.
It's that our political system seems increasingly incapable of actually solving problems.
Right.
And that just erodes trust.
Yes.
Which creates this, vicious cycle of dysfunction.
Exactly. And that inability to find common ground to compromise and work towards solutions is a major red flag for Diamond.
Okay.
He sees echoes of this in the political gridlock that preceded Chile's downfall, remember?
That's a sobering thought.
It is.
Are we really headed down that same path?
It's a good question.
I mean, the U.S. has a long history of overcoming challenges, right?
We do.
The Civil War, World War II.
Yeah.
Those were pretty intense moments, but we managed to pull through.
We did. And Diamond acknowledges America's strengths, our wealth, our diversity, our innovative spirit, and our, at least in theory, functioning democracy. Okay. He's not saying doom is inevitable, but he is urging us to learn from history, both our own and that of other nations.
So it's not about panicking.
No.
It's about being aware of the warning signs and taking action before it's too late.
Exactly. Diamond's message isn't about despair. It's about empowerment. Okay. He's saying we have the capacity to change course.
Yeah.
But we need to recognize the urgency of the situation and be willing to make some tough choices.
Okay, so assuming we take those challenges seriously, how do we actually start tackling them?
Yeah.
Where do we even begin?
Well, remember those 12 factors Diamond identified for successful crisis resolution.
Yeah.
He argues those same principles apply here.
Okay.
Honest self-appraisal, acknowledging our shortcomings as a nation, accepting responsibility, recognizing that we all have a role to play in fixing these problems, learning from others, looking at how other countries have dealt with similar challenges, and crucially, being willing to adapt, embracing new ideas and approaches, even if they challenge the status quo.
It sounds like he's calling for a pretty fundamental shift in our national mindset.
It is.
No more kicking the can down the road or hoping that someone else will fix things.
Right.
We each need to step up and be part of the solution.
Exactly. And this brings us to Diamond's final and perhaps most expansive chapter.
Okay.
What lies ahead for the world as a whole?
Ooh.
He zooms out from the U.S. and looks at the big picture, identifying 4 interconnected global challenges that could have a huge impact on everyone everywhere.
So we've gone from personal crises to national upheavals.
Right.
Now we're tackling global threats.
We are.
What does Diamond see on the horizon?
He focuses on nuclear weapons, climate change, resource depletion, and global inequality.
Okay.
These aren't exactly new issues, but Diamond argues that they're reaching a critical point where inaction could have catastrophic consequences for humanity.
And here's the kicker, right?
Yeah.
Unlike individual nations, which have at least some experience with crisis resolution, the world as a whole lacks a shared history of successful collective action on this scale.
That's true.
Can we really come together as a global community
Yeah.
to address these existential threats?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
Can we overcome our differences, our short-term interests, and find ways to cooperate on these massive challenges?
Right.
It's a daunting task, but Diamond suggests that the lessons we've learned from studying individual and national crises might offer some guidance.
So the same principles that help people navigate personal crises and nations overcome upheavals could potentially guide us towards a more sustainable future for the planet.
It's a possibility.
That's a powerful idea.
It is.
But how do we actually put it into practice?
That's where things get really interesting and where each of us has a role to play.
Okay.
Diamond doesn't offer easy answers,
Right.
but he reminds us that the future isn't predetermined.
Hmm.
It's shaped by the choices we make individually and collectively.
Oh.
Our ability to honestly assess the situation, accept responsibility, learn from others, and be willing to compromise and adapt, these are qualities that will be essential if we're going to navigate the global crises of the 21st century.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into upheaval, I'm left with a question for our listeners to ponder. What lessons from history, from your own personal experiences, from the stories of nations, might help us address the pressing issues facing our own society and the world at large? Can we, like individuals and nations in crisis, find the courage to change, the wisdom to adapt, and the will to build a more resilient and sustainable future? It's something to think about as we head back into our own complex and ever-changing world.
Indeed, and perhaps in reflecting on these lessons, we might just find the inspiration and the tools to create a future worthy of the challenges and the possibilities that lie ahead. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.